Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And Talli, this is not supposed to be our premiere episode. We had another episode in the pipeline, but because of the crazy situation which all Jews find ourselves in today with the terrible war going on in Gaza and the horrific events that have taken place over the past couple of weeks, we have put that episode aside for the time being. We will, Bezrat Hashem, get back to it when things are a bit cooler emotionally and practically. In the meantime, we wanted to talk about a very important topic which a lot of people are dealing with now, which is about love and intimacy in wartime. It's a very serious topic. It's something which a lot of people are struggling with. And I can't promise we have so many answers, but we can at least address some of the questions and offer some of the issues and validate the way people are feeling right now.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot to talk about in general about our own emotional states, our emotional and mental health, and those of our loved ones. I think what I want to do is discuss with you today this idea of relationships and marriage, where marriage is a place of security and intimacy, and where in a time of major global conflict and people who want to kill us and feeling threatened and being in a complete state of survival, I think it's important to talk about how this impacts our basic attachments of security. Do we seek security in our relationship, or does conflict at this level and does walking around in this level of stress actually spill over into our relationships? There's a lot of people who have been asking a lot of questions. Am I normal? Is this normal? Are we normal? Whether it has to do with just finding time to connect with your partner, finding time to be intimate or sexual with your partner. People have very different experiences of this. Some people really need to connect. Other people really need to not connect. And I thought what might be helpful today, Scott, after you give your introduction, is that we maybe try to understand a little bit more about the kind of science of stress and how it affects us individually and how it affects us in relationships, so that we can normalize for people what they're going through, but we can also increase awareness and talk a little bit about how to regulate yourself, how to maintain some sort of emotional stability and equilibrium at a time where we are all being highly tested in our ability to contain both ourselves and others.
Okay, that sounds like a really important topic. I'm looking forward to hearing what you say about that. Given everything going on, I'm going to forego our normal introduction. I'll simply say people should go to the website, intimatejudaism.com, where they can find our full archive and various show notes, etc. And we'll just move forward at this point. I'd like to open up with something which is actually related to this week's Parsha. We're recording on Thursday, October 19th, which is a couple days before Parshat Noach, where we read about Noah and his family going into the ark. And this, I felt, was actually somewhat relevant, even though the situation there is quite different. But when the world was being destroyed, which is what that parsha is talking about, at the beginning, when Noah is told to build the ark, he's told to go in. It says in the pasuk, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives. And then when he's told to come out when the flood is over, the pasuk says it somewhat differently. It says, come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and their wives. In other words, going in, Noah went in with his sons, and his wife went in with his daughters-in-law. And coming out, the couples came out together. From this, Rabbi Yochanan in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Kufchet Amud Bet, page 108b, cited by Rashi on the Parsha, points out that during the time of the flood, while they were in the ark, sexual intercourse was forbidden. In other words, there was no real physical intimacy between the couples. So that's what happened according to the Gemara. But what's the reasoning behind the prohibition on the couples having intercourse for the duration of the time they are in the Teva, the ark? We can understand it better by looking at Masechet Ta'anit, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, page 11a, in the name of Reish Lakish. Amar Reish Lakish says, Asor le'adam l'shamesh mitato b'shanei ra'avon. It is forbidden for a person to have intercourse while there is famine outside. Shene Amar, and his proof text is quite interesting. It says, in the pasuk, Uliosef yulad shnei banim b'terem tavo shnat hara'av. Joseph, when he was the viceroy of Egypt, had two children, and the pasuk says an unnecessary phrase, before the years of famine came. Remember, there were 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph and his wife Asnat had children before the famine, from which they learned that during the years of famine, when the world is in tsa'ar, when the world is feeling stress, trouble, misery, tragedy, one is not allowed to have sexual intercourse. Now, it does continue there and say that this does not apply in certain situations. The Gemara in particular mentions if a person does not have children yet, this does not apply. And there are other caveats that are mentioned in the Sifrei Halacha. And I'll mention that in the Shulchan Aruch, this is brought down as halacha l'maseh, as a practical Jewish mandate. And the Ramah there says it doesn't only apply to years of famine, it also applies to other tzarot, other times when people are feeling stress. And even today, in Pnei Halacha, Rav Melamed says it applies when there is a milchama kolelet, which I presume means a very big war. I don't know where that applies. I am not giving a halachic psak right now. I'm not talking about what people should do. Really, that's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm trying to say that halacha, the Jewish law, acknowledges that when things are difficult outside, there's an emotional state which people have when they're intimate as a couple, which is somehow seen as not working together with that. It doesn't work naturally together. People outside feeling upset when inside you can let yourself go to total abandon. There's something which Jewish law sees as perhaps not appropriate about that. Perhaps these halachot are reflecting an inner psychological state that we're supposed to have or that we naturally have, which is that when people are in a state of tragedy, then the idea of having intimate relations with a spouse just doesn't work. I'm curious what you have to say about that, Talli, too, because again, I'm not giving psak here, but as a philosophical concept, this is something which Jewish law says elsewhere. It's also true that when someone's sitting Shiva, he also or she also is prohibited from having sex during that 7-day period. Halacha says when you are upset about something, there's something that is incongruent about having sexual intercourse. That's sort of my introduction halachically, again, not as a giving psak, but to try to say it's sort of the philosophical idea that sex and tragedy don't mix that well. And I guess you could say sex and trauma aren't natural bedfellows, we could say. And I'm going to say one more thing before I hand it over to you, Talli, because I heard about a story, and I'm sure the story has repeated itself many times. I told you this yesterday, and you suggested that I ask you this, about a typical couple, and this is someone said this anonymously, saying that she and her husband, during the current war, this is something that happened very recently, were unable to be intimate, but they decided to be intimate, to have, I think, intercourse one night. And as they were about to begin being intimate, she burst into tears. And I don't know what that means, but I can certainly understand that it's a very, very relatable story for a lot of people. And perhaps to open up, can you talk about some of the psychological factors that make that so, that went into what her reaction was?
There's a lot. There are many questions here. And I also want to relate to what you spoke about, whether it's appropriate or not, or whether we are wired to have intercourse. I don't even want to speak specifically about intercourse, but I do want to speak about how we as humans are wired to connect. And I'm going to start just kind of with the feelings that many of us are walking around with. People want to see us dead. They hate us. They are our neighbors. And many of us hope to have peace with them. And many of the people who were murdered, slaughtered, were peace activists. They lived very close to the border, and many of them really believed that we could live together in peace. And living close to a border puts you in a very vulnerable position, and then your safety is threatened. So there is like this complete sense of shock, of betrayal, and of a complete lack of security, a lack of feeling that you can be safe on a global level with your neighbors, with those partners, right? And if I bring it to a familial level, our homes, and this is where people were threatened in their very homes, in their bedrooms, in their most safe spaces. And even if we were not directly affected, we don't live in the South, but every single person who watches the news, who have seen what's going on, has been affected. There's been a chadira, so to speak. There's been a forced entry. We've been violated. And unfortunately, women were also violated sexually. And so we are all feeling this kind of real sense of loss and also confusion about what does it mean to be safe.
I just want to point out one thing, which is almost a side point. You mentioned how here we don't live in the South, so we didn't have that immediate feeling of that. Last night, I happened to be interviewed on a Catholic podcast that's based in Washington, D.C., and I was saying the same thing. So, well, we're an hour away. And the host almost laughed and said, an hour away isn't very far here. An
No,
hour
it's
away is
not.
pretty close. I think we're just used to the
We're
smallness
in
of
it.
Israel, and we're like,
We're
oh,
in
well,
it.
we're far, we don't live in the South. We live only an hour away from it, and everybody in Israel is close on some level. It's not that far for anybody.
We are all affected by this. And I think it's important to just start out with understanding what's happening to us. People throw around words, and I invite our listeners, I think this is day 13. I believe it was day 2 or 3 that we sat down and spoke on Orthodox Conundrum. I would urge people to hear that if you didn't. We spoke just about the initial place of being. And I said, then, there's really nothing to talk about post-trauma because we are still in the trauma. And what we are all in is referred to as an acute stress response. When we are experiencing stress, our bodies change. We go into a fight, flight, or freeze mode. And we might go from flight to fight to freeze. We might not always be in the same mode, but we are now wired in a way that's not meant to be the default way of being in life. We're wired in an aroused state, either a hyper aroused state or a hypo aroused state if we're numbed out or frozen. And it's interesting because when I do regular couples therapy, not in times of war, but just in general, a lot of what I talk about is how we trigger one another into one of these states because of fear, because of abandonment, anxiety. And so if a partner is afraid that their partner is going to leave them or says something that triggers them, they go into fight flight. And one of the most important tools for maintaining marital harmony is this kind of sense of self-awareness. Am I going into a stress response? How do I calm that stress response? And how do I kind of regulate myself emotionally so that I can kind of go into my more cognitive, logical, rational space? When we are in a high sense of anxiety or fight flight, it's very difficult to access our frontal cortex, our prefrontal cortex. And so it goes offline and our behaviors are not so well thought out or rational. Why am I saying all this? Because right now, that's the state that we're in and that we have to be in because we are in survival mode. And that is likely to spill over into our most intimate relationships, even though our most intimate relationships are meant now to be our resource. And what I want to talk about is how can we turn our most intimate spaces, our families, our children, our marriages, our friends, our communities, into our resources so that we can begin again to create some sense of equilibrium and some sense of safety. And then I'm happy to talk about how sex might change or be different. This is all really new. I've already been asked to join a study to look at what happens with relationships or sexual relationships. It's very, very early. We haven't really collected any data. My sense is that whatever you feel right now is okay. You feel like you want to bond and have sex, it's understandable because there is something about sex that gives you a sense of vitality. And so, like, we don't know what happened in the Holocaust, right? But we know people had sex because there were babies born during the Holocaust. There is something about survival that does include this idea of continuity, aliveness. And I think that we can really, really value that and understand that. I think people also, when they get diagnosis for cancer or stuff like that, we have evidence that they're interested in sex. People think, what, you have cancer? Why would you be interested in sex? Because in the face of death, people cling to life. That's part of survival. So in people who are wondering, why am I wanting to have sex or why am I wanting, I can understand too the question of why am I wanting to just have closeness, because this is the antidote to trauma. It's connection. I'm seeking connection. I want to soothe. I want to feel safe. I want to hug my partner. I want to feel the hormones of oxytocin, which is an attachment hormone, because I've got so many stress hormones in my body, and oxytocin will help me relieve that stress. Is that adaptive? It's not always adaptive if you're living in real, present, and clear danger. But if you can hug between sirens, then it might be just adaptive enough. But for those people who have no desire for sex, that's completely normal as well. And, we want to be able to normalize all of our different, because everybody reacts differently in these situations.
I want to ask you, Talli, because you talked about survival right now, and it was something that you sent to me. You sent me some notes, and I wasn't sure what something meant, and perhaps you can just explain this. Perhaps you already did. You wrote something there that says survival versus relational. Could you explain what you meant by that phrase?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I send you all of these notes and you probably look at them and say, what is she talking about?
Well, it gives me good questions to ask because I don't understand them.
Okay. When I work with couples and couples bring their survival brains, let me just give a little tiny introduction about the brain. I'm sure most people know this. Our emotional limbic responses are in the lower parts of the brain. Our higher parts, our more developed parts, are where the prefrontal cortex and the higher level thinking, higher level functioning. But our survival brain is kind of lower down. We call it sometimes the reptile brain. And what we know about the activation of our amygdala, which is in the emotional brain, which helps us to survive. It detects threat. It tells us to run or to fight. Our amygdala is there in order to detect threat, in order to create the stress response and allow us to survive. And what I tell my couples, they often come in and they're coming in with this feeling of threat and with behaviors related to being threatened, to feeling threatened. And when they come in that way, there's really no connection. The partners don't connect because they are acting defensive or aggressive or reactive. And I'm seeing that now too. I'll give you an example. But what we need to understand is that even though those responses may have been what allowed them in the past to survive their past traumas in life, they were adaptive then. Those responses that they had then, whether it was to disengage or run away or shut down or even fight, they may have learned these responses because of past experiences or past traumatic experiences. What they learn in therapy is that adaptive then, not adaptive now, and that survival responses are not consistent with relational skills, because relational skills require thinking. It requires regulating yourself. It requires saying the thing that isn't going to trigger your partner, trying not to be defensive or trying not to be in contempt of our partner. So what I've been seeing clinically, and I've been working through this and just doing a lot with the couples that I already have that are in my practice. So, and I work with trauma and I work with trauma and intimacy. And you're right, what you said before about how it seems that trauma and intimacy can be incompatible. So people who have post-trauma, and we're not talking about post-trauma from this because we're not there yet, but people with past trauma, when they are activated, they are not in a place for intimacy because intimacy is threatening. Relationships feel threatening. Letting your guard down when you need to be hypervigilant feels threatening. And so I've seen couples where I have a couple of couples where the man has PTSD and they come in and say, okay, I got tickets. Let's go. We're going back. And the wife is like, what are you talking about? We're not leaving. And
you're talking about couples in Israel right now during the current situation.
Yeah. No, we got to go. We got to get out of here. It's the flight response. And by the way, for many people, the flight response was also the thing in the marriage that was there before. So the things that were there before get intensified and they'll come in very aggressively. But really what's underneath the aggression, which thank goodness I was able to help the couple in both cases reach, is what's underneath these feelings is fear. I'm the man of the house. I'm afraid for my family. I need to keep them safe. And when they were able to be vulnerable, then the other partner who didn't want to leave was able to say, wow, I really get it now. And if that's what you need, then for sure, let's go back and go stay with our parents for a few weeks until this thing calms down. When they heard it, their response was contempt. Like, what's the matter with you? All these guys are going to the front and you just want to run away, right? So, really trying to understand the different reactions. We talked in the episode a little bit that we didn't release about different attachment styles. If you are, more securely attached, you will seek connection in order to soothe. But if you are, let's say, afraid of attachment, if you're avoidant attachment, you may really not be available to engage with your partner. You might be working on kind of self-soothing. I think that this whole is understanding and having self-awareness of what's happening with ourselves and how that plays out in our relationships. These attacks are attacks, not just on our bodies, but they're also attacks on our souls. It's an attack on our identities as Jews, as Zionists, as believers. People can have a great crisis of identity, especially people who, like me, I believe, I was not so right wing. I really was very, I believed that we could have a two-state solution and that we could have peace. And I feel very betrayed. So I think a lot of people can relate to this idea of a crisis of identity, a crisis of identity in roles, fathers and mothers. I mean, there are women who are going out to the front. They're used to being providers. Now they're fighters in the army. There's so many changes, immediate changes, and our bodies and our souls are in shock.
So what would you say, Talli, now that we've validated that reality on the ground in practice, what would a couple do? Let's just speak about a given couple where they each have different responses, very different responses, where, for example, one member of the couple, one spouse is feeling trauma and the last thing he or she wants to do is to be intimate or have any sort of emotional connection in that kind of physical way. Whereas the other spouse, that's the main thing that they want. As you said, even during the Holocaust, that's the way that people feel alive, or someone who has a cancer diagnosis. That's how they cope because it gives them a feeling of life. So what should a couple do? And I realize every couple is different, but perhaps just some general ideas when they have very different types of emotional responses to the trauma that we're experiencing right now. What can they do about that?
Right. So this is a very challenging time because this is a time where we really, really need to be able to differentiate with our partners. We need to be able to have the ability to say, this is how I feel, and this is how you feel, and we can contain the differences without getting personally offended or personally injured. I mean, there are so many different possibilities for disruption of wanting the same things. For example, one partner may want to be out of the house all day volunteering, and the other one will say, no, you need to be home with the kids. You can't go running around. Or one wants to leave the country, or one has religious or political differences and they didn't used to be a problem, but now they just feel really annoying. So this ability to be able to contain, to be able to soothe yourself and to not engage when you are in your reptile brain, to be able to say, you know what, I'm activated. Now is not the time to talk about this. And what we want to be able to do is recognize, why is it that I'm feeling this way? Is it rational to feel abandoned? I mean, we're going to feel abandoned. If your partner is going off to war, you're going to feel abandoned. You can feel abandoned, especially if you have a lot of abandonment trauma. But there's another part of you that's going to be able to say, look, this is what needs to happen. And you're going to think about and look for the resources that you have. Right now, it's really about looking for resources within our family, within our marriage, and also looking for resources outside of that. So I would really urge people, please, now more than ever, we don't have peace, but we can still have peace in the home. It is so important now to come together and to give one another the benefit of the doubt, because we're all on edge. And so if we're normally going to be short with one another, it can be worse now. Forgive, validate, try not to judge. Don't take things personally. Communicate with a lot of I statements. I'm feeling worried. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling vulnerable. it is amazing how that is exactly what brings connection, is when you're able to expose, which is the exact thing that right now on a survival level we're afraid to do globally. It's very hard to hold both of that need to be defensive and reactive and be in complete survival mode, and yet with our partner, be open and vulnerable. And that's kind of what brings us back to this idea of sex.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I know a lot from post-trauma. What post-trauma is that the same symptoms that we're having now, which is normal to have now because we're in the trauma, people will have well after the source of danger is no longer there. That's really what post-trauma is about. It's like a month after, there's no clear and present danger. It has to be at least a month after. And by the way, I think everyone should know, everyone who's worried about post-trauma, that a very small percentage of people go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. We want to be aware of our resilience, and we want to be aware of the fact that we will not necessarily have long-term mental health challenges. Most of us are going to be okay. We're going to get through this. And it really is important, I think, to put that out there.
Talli, it's one of those phrases that I think people use almost flippantly. Oh, yeah, I've got PTSD, talking about some situation which was perhaps broadly traumatic or perhaps not. But it's just one of those terms that people use all the time. My guess from conversations with you and others is that it is not necessarily a helpful term to use if it's not real. PTSD is an actual disorder, and as you said before, it affects only a very small minority of people who've been through trauma, and describing any sort of remembering that trauma as a form of PTSD, even colloquially, is probably not healthy and perhaps even damaging.
Right, correct. Look, I think like anything else, it's on a spectrum. So full-on PTSD has very specific diagnostic criteria. Intrusive thoughts and flashbacks and nightmares and being very easily activated in crowds and, kind of what we're feeling now, right? But people feeling that well after there is no...
Right. Now it's without the P.
Stress, right. But it's not binary. It's not either you are, you're just this totally chill person or you're PTSD. There's like a huge spectrum. So kind of knowing where you're at on that spectrum. So you're right. I think that we don't want to walk around talking about how we have PTSD. We want to talk about, I think I said this on Orthodox Conundrum, we want to use words like building and resilience and healing. And we also want to be able to acknowledge and give gratitude to the way that our bodies are in this hyper aroused state. That's helping us. That's helping us to survive right now. It's helping us to go out and volunteer and do a zillion things. And it's helping all these mental health professionals across the country and across the world to help provide immediate intervention, which is really amazing to see all the therapists coming together and working to provide emotional aid resources. And so, these are our strengths. This is what makes us a resilient people. Okay, so of course I'm off track because my executive functioning has also decreased as being under stress, but actually I think I'm doing all right.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. Yeah, but we're going to talk about sex.
We were going to talk about sex. Okay. So specifically, you had asked before about crying with orgasm. And okay, so here's what I want to go back. When I work with trauma and sex, so what we know about the experience of sex is that generally when you are experiencing letting go, you're experiencing relaxation. Your body's relaxed, your mind's relaxed, and you're open and vulnerable to an experience of connection, to an experience of pleasure, to an experience of heightened arousal that can lead to an orgasm, which, can feel a little bit out of control, but you kind of know where you're going with it. You've done it before and you know that it feels good and then your body goes back to normal. It's all good. But if you have symptoms of post-traumatic stress, or now when we are all experiencing symptoms of stress, it's very reasonable to not be able to let go, because letting go isn't consistent. Even something as simple as a siren's going to go off. How can you really relax and let go if a siren might go off in the middle and you don't really have enough time to put your clothes back on and get to the mamad? So that's just from a technical level, but even from a level of just feeling so hyper vigilant or just feeling So, not being able to shut your mind off. So people will talk about how they have difficulty reaching orgasm. They'll talk about how they have intrusive thoughts as they are about to reach orgasm. Certainly crying, we're raw. So crying is a very normal response because a lot of people will hold their emotions in all day. And then when you have an orgasm, it's kind of like a release of emotion. So that's when you let yourself go and you let yourself cry. And then unfortunately, and I really debated if I should bring this up, but we've been exposed to a lot of things, and it's a little bit of vicarious trauma, especially if you're looking at a lot of TikToks and videos, which I don't really recommend to do. But it is normal to kind of have these intrusive thoughts during sex that can affect your function. And so what I want to say is that everything is okay. Know what you want. Maybe you just want intimacy. Maybe you just want cuddling. Maybe you just want closeness. Maybe you do want sex, but you just need to be aware that whatever it is that you want is okay. And you need to communicate that with your partner.
I'm curious if what you think about this, Talli, because when I first heard that story, the thought that immediately went through my mind as a non-therapist was a sense of betrayal. I'll explain what I mean. Meaning my thought in terms of my initial interpretation of that story about why that person started crying or before they reached orgasm was, how could I see those videos, see people being massacred, children down on the front right now, getting ready to put their lives on the line, and I'm just having fun with my partner. I didn't know if that's part of it also, or if that's really off base.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. I think that's so important that you brought that up. And I want to talk about that for a minute. And we're going to call that now survivor's guilt. And I think we can also talk about something known as moral injury. That's going to come later. That's kind of like the feelings of how could I have let this happen? People who weren't able to save their friend or family member. But what I want to talk about now is survival, because I think just about every single person I talk to in some way will say something along the lines of, I feel bad because, I feel guilty because, how could I, have pleasure when? Look, I think that makes sense. It does make sense. We are in a very, very tragic time, and people have lost entire families. They're mothers without children and children without mothers, and kibbutzim that have lost almost half of their population. I mean, it's we can't even wrap our heads around the loss. And then there are like levels of distance from that depth of trauma, but we're all traumatized by it to some level. Each person needs to be able to draw on their own resources and to give themselves compassion and permission. Because the way I look at it, the more we take care of ourselves and the more we can kind of continue to live in the face of death. And for many people, sex might be that vitality. For other people, it's also that, but also volunteering or also doing other things that may give some sense of meaning in your life. These are the ways that we survive. And these are also the ways that we help other people. And the more that we take care of ourselves, the more that we put on our, they say on the airplane, put on your oxygen mask first, which is not so intuitive. We think we want to put it on our kids first, but they do say put on your oxygen mask first so that you can be in a state to help other people. And, I don't think that we're at a place where we can soothe guilt for people. Like, I'm not going to say don't feel guilty. I'm going to say, yeah, I hear that. I hear that you're struggling with those feelings. I think we're all to some extent struggling with these feelings. And what you're bringing up now is the sense of, sex is something that has been associated with pleasure and fun. How can I be having pleasure and fun when there's this tragic experience going on all around me? And I think it's also about creating different meanings. Yes, there's pleasure, but there's also meaning. There's meaning that has to do with the perpetuation, if that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to, and I think we'll see that probably kind of later, but this idea of I am fighting for my life. I'm fighting for my family. I'm fighting for my partner, my relationship. I'm fighting for love, fighting for connection. And I don't think that we need to feel guilty about that. I think that we need to feel resilient about that.
That's interesting because as I think about that Gemara that I quoted at the beginning with Reish Lakish saying that in a time of famine, you cannot have sex unless you don't have children.
Right.
And
Exactly. I was
that's really
thinking
what it's
that.
all about. That's kind of what
Yeah.
it is. This sort of balance between that survivor's guilt, that sense of how could I feel the sense of abandon when everyone else feeling abandoned? How could I just let things go when there's tragedy outside? But on the other hand, if life is my goal, then if I don't have children, then I have to do this. This is actually an obligation on some level. This is very important. That's what I was noting there.
I mean, I think that if we take out the directive part of it, because I don't think it's a halachic statement. I mean, I think it's kind of giving permission. In a tragic time, if you don't feel like having sex, it's okay not to. And he put it in different words, you can't. But I don't know that that's halacha l'maaseh. I don't know if that's the practical halacha. I think the point here is that there's definitely an awareness amongst Chazal that in times of disruption, this will also disrupt marital life. I do also want to say, don't feel obligated. There's kind of a movement to promote sexuality sometimes. I don't know, like there's this sense that sex is such a big mitzvah and, you should. I think that it's really important to not feel pressured to do it if you don't feel like doing it. And to feel like, listen to yourself, listen to your body. Your body is a really important resource. It's telling you what you feel. It's telling you when you feel anxious. It's telling you when you need to listen to those feelings inside. It's telling you when you might need to regulate and bring it down a little bit. Maybe do some relaxation, maybe get yourself into what we call the window of tolerance, meaning that we're not overly panicked, or we're not completely numbed out to the point where it's like disturbing, like you're in a catatonic state. Okay, the window of tolerance is where you can still be functional. You feel feelings, but you can still be functional. You're not panicking, or you're not completely dead. You might not be feeling things because your body is numb or you went numb, but that is also adaptive right now.
I want to ask you about after, meaning Bezrat Hashem, when Israel is victorious, when this war is finished, after. When things go back to whatever normal will look like in the future, I'll say that I have a feeling that things are not going to be the same ever again. This is very, very big, and we know that it's big, but I have a feeling that we don't even realize how big it's going to be in retrospect. I could be wrong, but I have a feeling this might recalibrate a lot of different things. It might be a sort of realignment in many different ways, religiously, socially, and politically. Whatever normal is in the future, it's going to be a normal that's after this huge event. And that means the people will be carrying this trauma with them on some level, and that can have repercussions when it comes to a couple's intimacy. Once it's over, aside from the most extreme cases of PTSD, just for regular couples that don't necessarily experience a disorder, but who have gone through a serious trauma, what sorts of things should they be on the lookout for that might be problems that they can anticipate, and therefore anticipate in such a way they can avoid the problems?
Like I said before, we all have different responses to stress. And I believe that we're all going to have a different way of recovering. And some people will recover in a way that will require them to process a lot and talk about it. And other people will recover in a way where they put it away. And I also, we didn't even talk about the epigenetic experience of trauma. Many of the people I'm seeing are third generation Holocaust survivors. And in fact, that might be part of the response that they have in their DNA and their genes that have been passed down. Somebody said to me, look, I have ancestors that all died. This person that wanted to just go back. I believe that was something that he felt very viscerally, that he had to run away, because part of the narrative of his life was that they didn't leave Europe when they should have, when they could have. So I think that how we make meaning from the trauma is probably going to be what's significant here. And I am looking for the day when we will be after, when we can talk about this as something that was in the past. When we talk about trauma, we talk about something that we will never be the same after it. It is a watershed event that will change us. But I am really looking forward to that after, to where we can feel safe again, and we can feel that we are on a healing journey from this terrible, shocking experience, and that we can live in a world that is safe. I really hope that happens.
I really hope so too. I guess we can end with a tefillah, a prayer, that Hashem should take care of all of Am Yisrael and the whole world and take care of us and make sure that we are safe, to make sure that we are able to experience this trauma in a healthy way. We can't avoid it because that's just not what's going to happen, but we can at least experience it in such a way that it can cause us to grow together as couples, as people, to develop stronger relationships with each other, to develop stronger ability to connect with each other, to develop stronger bonds of love with each other. I know that, Talli, we've seen tremendous unity among a people that 2 weeks ago was very much fractured. And to see people come together in such a strong way, that is one of the inspiring things that we've all noticed. I think everyone has been inspired by that national unity that's come together, both for people in Israel and outside of Israel. The Jewish people really feel besieged, and we have that sense of coming together. And I only hope that that real unity will continue and become a permanent part of Am Yisrael and will positively impact not just us as a people, but us as families, us as couples, us as friends, allowing people to come together and feel unified in whatever context they find themselves.
I wanted to add that as well. There's global conflict, and let's minimize conflict at home. It's my prayer to all the couples listening that they come together now, that they do give each other the benefit of the doubt. And for those of you who aren't in a partnered relationship, that you do find intimacy and find love and find connection and find commitment, even though this is certainly a time where everyone is bound to feel sabotaged in those areas. And so I hope for a safer, better, more peaceful world, and for peaceful and loving and connecting and attached, bonding relationships. And I just want to say one more thing. When we started out, I was like not in a good place. I just came from trying to do some yoga because I was really anxious. I didn't sleep last night. I feel a lot better. I think just having this conversation calmed me a little bit. And so I appreciate the opportunity. And I also think it's good to talk to people, talk to your friends.
And thank you, Talli. As you know, it's always really enlightening to speak with you, and I get a lot out of it, as I'm sure all of our listeners feel as well. And I want to thank our listeners, too, for joining us today. I'm sorry that our opening episode of Season 6 of Intimate Judaism was not one of our more fun and carefree types of episodes, but I think we talked about a very important topic. And hopefully, Bezrat Hashem, as the season goes on, we'll be able to speak about the normal topics that we speak about here on Intimate Judaism and get back to our regular shigra, our regular schedule, in a healthy way. Please remember to share this podcast. Please remember to go to intimatejudaism.com, and thank you for joining us today.
Yes, and please give us feedback. We would love to hear what you felt and thought listening to this episode. So thank you. Bye.